Hello and welcome to Think Like a Game Designer. I'm your host, Justin Gary. In this podcast, I'll be having conversations with brilliant game designers from across the industry with a goal of finding universal principles that anyone can apply in their creative life. You could find episodes and more at thinklikeagamedesigner.com. Today we have a special double guest episode of Think Like a Game Designer, which invited back Richard Bartle, who was one of the creators of the first MUDs, multi-user dungeons, and created Bartle's Taxonomy of players, which I've referenced all the time. You can listen to his original episode, which is great and chock full of goodies. And we also brought one of his longtime collaborators, Nigel Roberts, who also worked on the original multi-user dungeon. He is also one of the founders of the .gg web address and a member of the ICANN board of directors. We also get into some fun facts. He's actually the first person to successfully win a lawsuit against someone who sent unsolicited spam email in the UK. And we dig into that story as well. He has a lot of great insights, both from a technical and legal perspective on gaming, on how internet communities work. And we really get into it in this episode. We dig deep into not just how communities are built and how game designers can foster great communities, referencing Richard's book, How to Be a God, as well as Robert Heinlein's science fiction. We talk about the power and the magic of what if. How can you break from the understood norms of the industry, in their case specifically games that were all single player, to say, what if we could have a multiplayer game, and how you can encourage that in your own designs to make that next breakthrough. We talk about how you create a space for your teams, and as managers, how you create a space for people to ask that what if question. We talk about the power of the hero's journey and how it can apply to both your game designs and life. And we get into a pretty deep dive around how different communities can be formed, both from centralized command and regulation, whether you'd want to see maybe police officers regulating things like social media and game communities, or whether it should be left to the industries and the companies themselves. We talk about the power of cryptocurrencies and decentralization, and have some pretty interesting debates about what the good, the bad, what does ownership mean, how does this actually help, where does value come from, and we really dive into how to say something as a designer, the real keys about what makes you a game designer, what differentiates games from other art forms, as well as how you can cultivate this desire and cultivate the understanding of what it is that you really want to say. How do you express yourself as a designer? How do you create those experiences for your players? So it was a real great honor to get to have these two as guests, both bringing Richard back and having Nigel here for the first time. They have a lot of great perspective over many, many years in the industry. And so without any further ado, here are Nigel Roberts and Richard Bartle. Hello and welcome. I'm here with a special double episode of Think Like a Game Designer with Nigel Roberts and Richard Bartle. Gentlemen, it's so wonderful to get to have you both here.
Great to be here as before.
And I'm really pleased to be here for the first time.
Yeah. So, I mean, our audience will already be familiar with Richard because he's been on the podcast before, and you both are really kind of legends in the not just the game industry, but the history of the internet and how we think about connective networks. So I'm actually really excited to talk about both. So you were both kind of started working together. Am I correct that it was when you were kind of co-developing the first multi-user dungeons, or kind of around that time period? Is that right?
Well, what you mean is we're old, right?
Legends. I use the word legends.
Well, it's better than being myths. The person who started off MUD, which was like the first virtual world precursor to today's MMOs, was a mutual friend called Roy Trubshaw. Nigel was in the same academic year as him. I was the year under, so Nigel knew him before. Roy started writing this program called MUD. We both got involved. Nigel was chairman of the Computing Society, which I joined. And so, we've kept in touch ever since. It's a long friendship.
It is indeed. I can actually give you a little bit of a background as to how it all came about, which predates Richard's involvement by about 48 hours or something like that. So Richard reminded me a few weeks ago that how we met, which is that we were both apparently in a queue for tickets for a band at the university in Freshers Week, right? And we were just queuing up, and it was a long queue because very popular band. And we got talking, and turned out we had a lot in common. But a couple of days previous, it might have been as much as a week, I'd managed to wangle myself a room on campus, which was kind of unusual for somebody in their second year. I was a hacker even then, I guess. And so Roy and I were sitting together one day, and we'd been playing what you now know as Colossal Cave all the previous year. And we got all the way through. We even got the last point, which, if anybody on the podcast doesn't know what the last point is, you've got to take the magazines into the room that you can't get out of. Very last. Right. So, and we had the previous chair or treasurer, I forget what he was, a guy called Keith Rautenbach, came back for a visit first weekend in our second year. He'd been the chair or the treasurer of the Computer Society before Roy and I got involved. And we were just kind of, having a social visit. And we were talking about Advent, as we called it. And I just turned to Roy and said, what if, I'll come back to the power of what if in a minute, or the magic of what if you could have more than one person in the dungeon at the same time? And Roy got this implementer's look in his eye. He had this strange look in his eye. He turned around to me and said, you know what? I think I know how to do that. Do it with a shareable high segment. Old technology, I guess. But and he was off to the races. He was coding away in assembler language. And by the time I met Richard about a week later, Roy had a working prototype.
Yeah. So that's incredible. And again, we dug into some of the story in the last podcast that I did, but I want to dig into this idea because you kind of flagged it about the magic of what if, because I know you've given a talk about this recently, and that power of like how you go from a 0 to 1 innovation, right? Which is something like what you did, where it's like, hey, what if this world was different? What if the thing that we all take for granted, that video games are the single player experience, and that we could all now collectively play together, which has of course transformed the entire world of gaming. How do you approach that? How do you create space for those that want to do that next major innovation, that next 0 to 1? How does the magic of what if play out for you?
Well, I think if you're a manager, which I've not been much in my life, I've tried to avoid management roles all my life. I've either been an implementer or an enabler or something like that. But if you're a manager out there and you're listening to this, what you just said is absolutely right. You've got to give people space. You've got to say there's no such thing as a stupid question. In fact, some of the best questions are the stupid questions. Because if you try and shut somebody down or whatever because they don't understand something or they misunderstand something, you're closing off that creativity. There is this spark, what I call the magic of what if. And it's only something I've been thinking about, looking back on what I've done over the past, I'm not going to say how many years, but quite a lot. And it is, you just got to be able to ask those questions of people, and then other people will come up and they will show you what you should be doing.
Yeah, so I think that there's So I've done a lot of research into this. I've done some work with the Wharton School of Business, and we built games to help encourage this kind of space. And so the concept that you're referring to, I think, is often referred to as creating psychological safety, right? Creating a space where it's okay to be wrong, it's okay to not know, and in fact to encourage a challenging of assumptions and breaking through the patterns that are kind of the norms of what's happening. One of the challenges that comes when you do that, and I think it's absolutely a best practice. In our company, we do this once a quarter. We'll have just a pure assumptions challenging exercise. We'll take any one of our projects and just literally go through each assumption we have from the very fundamentals and see what happens when we challenge them. How do you balance that space creation, that what if creation, that exploration with the need to execute, right? With the need to kind of, you can't be questioning everything all the time, or you go too slow and things don't move. How do you think about that process of going from, okay, let's make sure we're questioning and circling back, to other times when, hey, no, let's now, move forward and stop going back? How do you balance that?
Well,
And this
I
may go
think
for either of you. Yeah.
if it's all right, I'll carry on with this for a second. I worked for the phone company for a while, about 8 or 10 years as a contractor at the research department near Ipswich, and I worked in quite an important part, but not what I did was so important. But the important part was kind of making sure that the software that was used to run the phone company didn't get introduced any bugs by any enthusiastic implementers. It was called build control. And I worked for a guy called Peter. And Richard and I we're from slightly similar backgrounds and challenging convention, which I hate to use that word, but it's become a bit of a cliche now for our university. It's become a strapline. But challenging convention is something that we do. And so I worked for this guy, and he asked me to go do something. It was probably just rebuilding an IBM PC or something. In those days, we had to put memory managers and stuff in to get Windows 3.1 running properly and so on. And I was trying to challenge his assumptions, say, look, we need to do it this way and it will run smoother and so on. And he just turned around to me and he used an expression that's a bit like RTFM. You've probably never heard this expression outside what I'm about to say, but it was JFDI, which stands for just please do it. So what you have to do, I think, to answer your question, is to teach the people that to understand where, if you're a manager, where you're coming from, what you need doing. You can't challenge. You can't challenge. Whether or not you should buy half fat milk or full fat milk for the tea club or the duck shop. It's there, but you have to be unafraid to hold up, speak truth to power.
Yeah, fascinating. I like the acronym modification there. So the somewhat I think when you kind of bring up this idea of what it's like to be in a phone company, or when you're talking about sort of more trivial execution decisions versus important execution decisions, I think about how the creative process is different. I mean, in many ways it's the same, and in some ways it's different depending upon both the type of thing you're making and the size of the team that you're working with, right? The bigger the team, there's more coordination that's required. And then maybe I'll create an opportunity for Richard to jump back in, because you've written you've not just made major impacts in computer games and digital production, but also writing nonfiction books and also fiction books. How do you think about the creative process insofar as it is the same or different between those different disciplines of, sort of educating, entertaining, telling a story? How much do those overlap for you, or how do you see those pulled apart?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you're a creative person, the problem isn't inspiration. The problem is, which of the many ideas do I have is the one I'm going to do? And if you've given a boring task to do, which is pretty well what I have to do most of the time in my academic work, well, creativity is something that you just do because that makes it less boring. Doesn't slow it down, doesn't speed it up, just makes it more interesting. And the students tend to like it because it's not the same as everybody else's boring stuff. Now, when it comes to industry, if you're consulting for somebody else, which is what I mainly do these days because I don't have $250 million to make an MMO, at least not last time I checked. With that, then you're still creating, but you're creating within someone else's parameters. And in a games industry, it's always within someone else's parameters. It's always, there are business requirements, there are financial requirements, there are deadlines, there are what can your team do. So even though you want to do something, because ultimately it's all about expression. As a game designer, you're trying to say something to the players. Yeah. So game designers are always, well, they're trying to say something. They should be trying to say something. If they're not trying to say something, then why are they game designers? It's like, why are you an author if you don't like writing? Why you're an actor if you don't like acting. And for game designing, well, you should be trying to say something. Otherwise, all you're doing is solving puzzles in puzzles of game design rather than some form of expression. So even though you're trying to say things, you do get compromises that you have to make with the teams you're working with and the people who are paying your money and everything else. To which there are creative solutions, but they're not creative solutions that enable you to say things to the people you want to say them to, namely the players. They enable you to say things to the people who are giving you instructions, as Nigel alluded to, but they don't let you say things, speak to your players. So don't let you express yourself to the players if there are too many constraints.
Can you disambiguous? Make that a little bit more concrete for people, rather. It's like because I love this idea that we're always trying to say something, but can you give maybe some examples from your own work or work that you're very familiar with of what was trying to be said in that work?
Okay, well, going back to Mud, because Nigel's familiar with it, what I was trying to say through that was it was to do with freedom. I wanted to say you have the freedom to be who you want to be. And so that's what the whole game was about, was trying to give people the freedom to find out who they were. So it was an identity solving thing, because the real world didn't let you do it, but the virtual world, we could let you do it. And that's what I was trying to say to the players. Look, you can be yourself. You don't have to follow what the rest of the world is telling you about you. The rest of the world sucks. This game, this world is for you to be the person you want to be. And if you don't know who that is, it's the way you find out. So that would be an example of expressing something. So that's about freedom. But there are other ways you can have freedom. Expression, sorry. There are other ways you can have expression. For example, you might want to build bridges between communities. You might want to bring people together. That would be a reason to create games. You might want to make people feel how other people feel. So you might create a world that's in a situation that's uncomfortable for many people because you're trying to express to them that this is what it's like living in some other country, or even your own country in a different part of it. So there are ways. If you've got something to say, then a game design is a way of saying it. Just as writing a book, writing a screenplay, choreographing a dance, writing songs, sculpting, artistry with paint.
Yeah,
I'll come up.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I agree with you that that's the kind of thing that all creative art forms, I feel like you have something that you want to say, you have some feeling, an emotion or thing you want to impart to your audience, whether that be game design or art or writing. Nigel, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was just going to jump in a little bit earlier because something Richard said was very, very, very interesting and fundamental. I mean, anybody who in 10 years ago or more recently played Second Life will know about people adopting different identities, gender in particular. But what Richard did in providing the platform for people to do it, that was the first time we ever saw anybody adopt a female persona in a game. Well, of course, we knew everybody who was playing, so we kind of knew who they were. Besides which, without being too politically incorrect, just about everybody who had a modem in those days was male. So we kind of knew that. Although, interestingly enough, I had a conversation with another mutual friend of ours who was in Richard's year at university. And we remarked really how back in the 1970s, late 1970s, there were about 35-40% of females in our year doing computer science. And in the 80s, that kind of evaporated. We never knew why. But going back to what Richard said, it is a kind of freedom. And as I say, I didn't actually realize until I read some of Richard's more recent writing how much the influence of growing up in the political environment, the social environment that we both did, certainly affected me. I just thought I got on with my life. I followed the British equivalent of the American dream and so on. But in fact, when I suddenly realized how much of the upper classes still ran the country, I still got this enormous chip on my shoulder. So virtual games allow you to explore that and adopt different genders, orientations. I'm not even going to go down the furry thing. So,
well, yeah, this is where people get to discover themselves and explore different aspects of their personality and representations. I mean, I'm a big believer that the kind of core reasons that we play games, as a species, is to be able to learn in a safe environment, right? We're able to explore and try different things out where the consequences are not the same as they are
to what
in
if,
real life.
doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. And so I think that the ability to explore different personas and different identities and try things on is just like when small children they play pretend and play fireman and play house and play those things, right? They're able to learn how these roles fit in areas where they're not real. There's no real consequences. And as adults, we need that too. It doesn't change that, there's still plenty of aspects of us to explore and learn and grow as we evolve. And so I think I want to kind of move the conversation in a direction, because not only, when we're talking about interconnected games, it's no longer just about pretending in a safe space. There's real connections that are made here. There's real things that get changed, and how we build the networks that connect people changes people's lives, right? Even the things like social media now, they're many ways gamified, right? How do I get likes? How do I, get engagement in the reinforcement systems? What types of information gets displayed to me? How does the algorithm display things, right? Whether that be in a game world, whether that be in a pseudo real world connection, where I would argue that, the social media connections are, sort of this gamified mediated thing, whether that be through the internet. And I know, Nigel, you were very involved in a lot of the ICANN and kind of protocols built there. And in fact, in my research, is it true that you actually were the first person in the UK to win a lawsuit for unsolicited email, receiving unsolicited emails? Did I get that right?
That's absolutely true, but that came out of left field. I wasn't expecting you to bring that one up. Yeah,
I did a little research before the show, and I had to bring that up. I'm really intrigued, but I'll let you tell that story a little bit. But I also want to make sure I want to frame it in the context of like literally how important those rules are, right? When are people allowed to contact you? What's the mediums through which they do so? How is that handled, and how that's going to shape the future of society? So you can tell that story, but I want to also steer us in the broader direction.
We'll come back to the story, and I'll rely on you to bring it up at the appropriate point. But one of the things that started to emerge in the late 90s, so really the inflection point is Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web, right? So late 90s, the internet starts to become really important in everybody's lives. And by the early 2000s, it's kind of exploded. And then, and this is something I work with day to day, bad things happen on the internet. We know this. And what seems to have happened is the village has become the world. I mean, Marshall McLuhan used this expression, the global village, back in the day. But every village, one in 2000, had bad guys, right? They did things and in a village, they were either ignored, buried under the carpet, or they were dealt with in not very, should we say, with fairly efficiently and maybe extrajudicially, right? With the spreading of that village to the entire globe, you have the creation of what I call intentional communities. So, give you an example. I'm a radio ham, or I was. I've been too busy to focus on it in recent years. You will find people making quite a decent thing out of running a forum just for those people. And then you get the dark web, people creating intentional communities of things we don't want them to create, like terrorism, child sexual abuse material, and so on. And that's a challenge that we have to deal with. And law enforcement and society in general is finding it's always playing catch up. If you go back to the 1970s, which was sort of like the equivalent in the UK of the 1940s and 1950s in the US, our government built a bunch of roads. They built motorways. And then bank robbers suddenly realize you get in a fast car, drive to the other side of the country, commit a bank robbery, and be back home in time, as we say, for tea. So law enforcement was just kind of based locally, a little policeman wandering around on bicycles. So they had to put them in cars and create what we call the flying squad. So this always happens, and society needs to catch up.
Yeah. So I'll use this as another opportunity to bring Richard back in, because as I recall, so I'm going to frame this also a little bit broader as centralized solutions and sort of systemic or decentralized solutions to these problems, right? We have worlds where most people are good, but there's always some bad actors. And we are trying to solve for a way to create a way for us to ideally optimize for the good and minimize the bad as we're bringing more and more people together. And I know your book, How to Be a God, kind of talks about this, right? You get to make the best of all possible worlds when you're designing a virtual world. What are some principles that come to play to make that outcome more likely to be good, or more likely to realize, whether it be your vision of the thing you want to communicate, or at least allowing people to express the best parts of themselves and create as safe a space as possible?
Yes. Okay. So the first thing to point out is that in a game, you might not want to say, sorry, it just said I'd reconnected. So the first thing to point out is that in a game, you might not want a safe space because you need some edginess in games. If it's a player versus player game, then yeah, of course you're going to want some conflict. And of course you're going to want some trash talking. And some people have got different thresholds to others. And if you've got a game for children, then that would be different to a game for adults who all know each other and are perfectly happy to use terms which they wouldn't in public. So there isn't just a binary, it's safe or it's not. It's whether it's within your parameters of being safe for you. Now, there are some levels at which society would want to step in and say, this isn't safe for society. You might not mind sitting around planning how to 3D print weapons or something, but the rest of us do, in which case society's laws and morals and ethics have to come in and take place. But within a game context, I'm all for designers being able to set the levels that they want or allow the players to set them. Now, as for what happens when the players do not conform to these social mores, well, there are a number of things you could do. Some of them haven't been tried, some of them have been tried, some of them are common. One common thing to do is just to ban the players for a short period, and if they keep coming back and misbehaving, increasing the ban until eventually you kick them out. Something else you could do is anybody who wants to play your game has to give you their credit card, and if they misbehave, you charge their credit card. Now, no one's tried that, but you could do that.
A bad actor tax. I love it.
Yeah, well, it costs money to service what someone's doing when they misbehave. So, yeah. Another thing you can do is have, there's probably a better word for it now, but they certainly used to be called blacklists, where, you see, it turns out that all the people who are sending emails to female celebrities telling them they're going to rape them and all this sort of stuff, it's actually pretty much the same bunch of people. The same person who writes to the MP saying that she's fat and they're going to kill her children and all sorts is the same person who writes to the other MP or to the celebrity or to the TV or radio news presenter. And if you identify those people, well, in outside the internet, you would, if someone's behaving like that, they go through a court process and then you lock them up. There's no reason why that couldn't happen on the internet, except that local governments don't run the internet. They abrogated that responsibility to the people who run the platforms. What perhaps should be happening is, instead of Facebook having to pay for 10,000 people to go looking through their posts for misbehaviors, Facebook should be paying the police to do that. And we should be having thousands of police officers doing it who are independent and who can work across multiple platforms and who actually got warrants so they can do arrests and things if bad things are happening. So that's perhaps in the future. We have similar things like if there's a sports stadium and misbehavior there, well, the sports stadium has to pay for the police to police the sports because they wouldn't be having to do it if the sports stadium wasn't there. Similar thing for social networks, and you could argue a similar thing for games if they're above a particular size.
Fascinating. Well, maybe this is a good opportunity to come back to Nigel's story on the being the enforcing arm of unsolicited emails. I know in the U.S. there's some regulations coming into place very soon about unsolicited text messages, because I know we have an election coming up, and so I'm getting nonstop text messages, which are very annoying through SMS. So I'm eager to see that gone. But I'm intrigued in how much you think this is a good thing in terms of like using government as an arm to enforce, as Richard was implying, maybe should be done for the broader internet more regularly. But there's another ethos here that I think a lot of people do enjoy, that the internet has a level of freedom and, extra government capacity, and that no government can really shut it down in the same way that, it can with physical things and space that it has. So there's some trade-off here between how much freedom we want to allow in this global network versus how much we want to be enforcing some norms that, let's face it, that people are going to be bad actors and will abuse whatever tools are available to them.
Sure. Well, before I start on you're keen to get to this story, and it's not as interesting as you think. But
all right. Well, we don't have to get into the details if it's not as interesting. I was just amused. I'm more interested in the principles.
But what's interesting is the use of the word freedom, right? So that was the last thing you said. And the thing is, and I went over to the dark side. I studied law after my computer science degree, but I did it about 20 years later. The difference between the way that the US and people in the US regard the word freedom and the way people in Europe, and by that I do very much include the United Kingdom, the British Isles in Europe, is slightly and subtly different. We're all talking about the age of reason. We're all talking about the Enlightenment. But the difference is that in Europe, we accept necessary and proportionate limitations on that freedom. We can't go out and buy a gun at we call it Tesco's, you call it Walmart. In Texas, you can go buy it at Walmart, I think. So we have those limitations. And what's happened over the past 20 years in the development of, should we say, law and rule-based, and so this is where it's directly on games now, and rule-based stuff, is that governments have realized that they cannot pay for police and prosecutors and the whole panoply of society the way it was done in the Victorian era to keep the lower classes and the proletariat in order, which is basically what a lot of the mechanism of society was up until recently. And they've been designing the laws so that people can do what you might call self-help. So in consumer law, they don't say that the local government's trading standards department is going to grab your dodgy market trader and haul him into court. What they say is, if dodgy market trader does something to you, you can go haul him into court, and you've got these weapons, and they build these weapons. One of the weapons they built was the law I used on unsolicited mail. And it was really designed originally for spam phone calls, which are even a bigger problem in the US. And I had a friend of mine who was very much around in the early days of the early 1970s. At the first job I went to, worked for a company called Digital Equipment Corporation. His name's John, and he's based in Boston. And he used to, should we say, retaliate when he got his spam phone calls. You know, if you get a spam phone call and the guy's got an 800 number, well, you can imagine what kind of fun you can have with that. This is back in the days before the internet became a thing at home. So
there's a lot of great videos of this now, and there's even like whole soundboards and recordings you can use
absolutely
to those robocalls that are very entertaining.
My favorite, Stewie Griffin.
Yeah, fantastic.
But so it was based on this principle, and I basically wrote to the people who'd sent me this spam email and said, "Look, this new law says you can't do it, and I'm charging you for doing it." And they just ignored it because, you know, nobody'd ever done this kind of stuff. So I said, okay, fine. And we went to what you guys in the US would call small claims court. Here it's the county court, and the way they do it is they divide it up into 3 slices, and they decide what the value of the claim is. And then if it's below £10,000, which is actually quite a lot, but if it's below £10,000, it goes onto the small claims track, as we call it. And that then means you're not liable to have to pay the other guy's legal expenses, even if you lose. So I pushed it through. They ignored it again. So there's no great Perry-Mason showdown here. It was basically a default judgment. Then the fun really started, because that's when it was. So I got the judgment, but as you probably know, getting a judgment is only half the thing. You've actually got to get them to pay up. And there are whole TV shows in England, I don't know if it's the same in the US, where they film bailiffs who go in and, you know, they take people's cars away, repo men and so on. So you have to then enforce. It didn't get to that stage. But what happened was I wrote to them and said, look, I've got this judgment, but the judge hasn't yet assessed damages. It's limited to £300 because that's the claim I made, small claims track, because that was the cheapest it could have been for the court fees. Are you going to pay up? So they decided to pay up. So I got a check for £300, which I framed and photographed. And then the press got involved, and it was kind of like, you know, we talk about the hero's journey in story, and basically games are story. But the other thing that the press like is David and Goliath. So this was classic David and Goliath. It went what you would now call viral. I was interviewed on national television and so on. But really, behind it all, it was just, you know, some guy from the north of England being awkward. And that's me.
Well, I love fighting the good fight here, and so it was. I'm glad we got to hear that story. I was entertaining. So one of the things that interests me, and I'm happy to come back to the hero's journey too, because I also find that to be a really important frame. One of the things that interests me now is, you know, sort of the new generation of game designs, and we've been experimenting with this too with our game Soulforge Fusion, of using using blockchain and using the ability to have more financial incentives and without removing the need for a centralized authority, using kind of, you know, algorithms and a public ledger to be able to encourage, incentivize, and enforce the kinds of behaviors that you want. And there's a promise here, not claiming that it's been delivered on yet, but there's a promise here that these systems can deliver that value that we want, which is a, you know, well-policed community that's enforcing the kinds of norms that we want, that's encouraging the kinds of behaviors that we want, without having to rely on the arm of the government or the inefficiencies of bureaucracy, or even a centralized game designer authority or, you know, social media CEO to tell us what's supposed to be happening. Do you, either of you, have thoughts on that system, either the promises or perils of a decentralized regulation system?
I'll
for
jump in quickly, but I think Richard is the guy who's going to have most to say on this. Obviously, you're talking about smart contracts. So what you're talking about is the players and the implementers designing a system whereby you have a set of rules, whatever they are, could be some completely wacky world, and there are consequences and rewards if you either obey them or don't. The one point I wanted to make is what's really worth doing at this stage is to review some work that was done in the 1940s and 1950s. And by that, what I'm talking about is the science fiction of Robert Heinlein, because there's an awful lot of stuff. I mean, you read some of the stuff he wrote then, you kind of think, well, is that character really Elon Musk? You know, that's kind of the thing. So, and I've got a bunch of books behind me here, which I haven't opened in 20, 30 years. So you're probably reminding me to get some of them down and have a read through in the next few days. But Richard, it's down to you, really.
Yeah, okay. So decentralization is fine until you don't want to be decentralized. If you want to change the rules of your game and you can't because everything's smart contracts, that's a problem. If you want to, if the players take it one way that you don't like, it's hard to rein them in. It really depends on what your blockchain actually, what value it carries. If it's a pointer to something that you control, then that makes it a lot easier for you to say, well, it doesn't point at what you thought it did, it points at something else now. But if you're doing that, then you've got a centralized system anyway, so what would be the point of it? If you're trying to give people freedom to do what they want with your game, it might be that what they want to do stops everyone else wanting to play it, which is something that we've seen a lot of in MMOs with real money trading, where people leave games because there's just too much interference from people who are
like the gold farming kind of concept.
Taking all the content. So I'd be interested to find out what it is that you're doing that requires blockchain.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different aspects to it that I would break down. One is, first, I'll just agree with you that I don't believe that kind of core game design decisions should be decentralized generally. Like, I think there's a skill to game design, and that's part of what the whole premise of this podcast is about. And that you if you give players what they say they want, a lot of times it will all fall apart very quickly, right? There's a certain amounts of tension and crafting that needs to come into design. But when it comes to how you empower the community, there are tools that blockchain allows that are, I think, easier. Not that they can't be done in centralized server systems, but they're a little easier to do with these decentralized systems. One is, creating, I think, players having control over a pool of resources that they get to then allocate towards different behaviors that grow the community. So, for example, being able to run tournaments and encourage content creators and build new kind of side projects and extra utility for the game. Being able to reward that sort of stuff directly and let the community decide which of those things they want to reward, I think is pretty valuable. And I'll just give an example of something that I've seen in the physical game space. So in Magic the Gathering, it's kind of what I grew up playing, the sort of physical trading card game. A fan-created format called Commander was something that the centralized authority of Wizards of the Coast, the creators of Magic, resisted for a very long time. But eventually, because they could just do whatever they wanted with the physical stuff, it became the most popular format, and then became now the way most people play the game. And finally, it took a while for the centralized system to correctly recognize and reward that. That could have happened way faster and more efficiently if the system was in a digital space to be more decentralized in which things get rewarded and how things grow over time, and to give people more of a sense of ownership of that direction of the social space, not necessarily the design space.
Well, when you say reward, what is the reward?
Well, so there's rewards in the form of, actual kind of cryptocurrency tokens and, monetary reward, as well as status rewards that you can, but primarily the fact that you can give, both collectible objects and tokens that have real monetary value.
Well, the tokens only have real monetary value if the players want to pay real money for them. They don't actually have any real. You couldn't sell them to a non-player, and also they'd cease to have. Well, actually, perhaps they wouldn't.
Yeah, but Richard, that's exactly the same with fiat currency, right? The value as people think it has.
Right.
It is, except that you've got to pay your taxes in fiat currency, so they do actually have a value. And the the law can come along and take away your person if you don't. Basically, you're giving people stars, like you were when you were at school. You got a little star for doing something, or at McDonald's you get a little star. They're little rewards, and they're nice to have, and they show some things. The other thing, though, is that when you say the community, not all the players are going to get involved in this. In fact, it sounds as if it's only going to be a very small number of players who will be doing all the stuff. So it's a bit like a modding community where a small group of people are working together to create utilities that are available for everybody in the game. But most people aren't interested in that. But if you empower that small community and give them abilities to change the game, you've got to be able to rein them in if they make changes that you really don't want.
Yeah, no, I think the modding community is a great analogy, right? It's a subset of people, and this is true in all forms of governance, right? Like, I mean, it's true. Very few people are actually involved in, even elections and everything else, right? It's a very that's a small subset of people that really care. And so a modding community is exactly that, where, hey, they're going to create these new experiences for players and they invest their identity in it. They get some social rewards for doing so. But imagine if that modding community, the number of players playing it, you can reward them, economically for that as well. And that players could put up bounties of this currency. And again, these currencies are exchangeable. So they're not just gold stars. They're gold stars that you can change into a, cheeseburger or into paying your taxes with some conversion. If you want,
somebody has to want the conversion. That's what we've seen hasn't happened. People don't want them because there's so much speculation going on.
Well, I mean, there's trillions of dollars of value out there, so there is some people want them. Some people want these coins, these currencies.
Well, trillions of dollars have been spent on them, but whether you can recoup the trillions of dollars when you spend them back,
sure.
That's the thing. I mean, it's got value while it's got value. But
right,
fair
enough.
I mean, I'm not saying that that it's a bad idea. I'm just querying whether it's something that you really want to bet the farm on.
Sure.
We're heading off here into economics, which is quite interesting. And again, this is something that maybe younger listeners won't be aware of. But although I guess in some countries it's coming back. When Europe was divided into two between the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet bloc and NATO on one side and on the other, most of the communist countries had what were called soft currencies, and they only had the value they had because the command economy said what those currencies were worth. And so if you wanted to go take a day trip across from West Berlin to East Berlin, you had to change so much, and you only got 3 for 1. So it's kind of the same thing here. It's once the barriers disappeared, those currencies basically became worthless. And I was there in Germany the day before. It was before reunification. It was in 1980, 1989, 1990 timeframe. On the day where they merged the currencies, and basically everything on the east. We happened to be on the east at the time. Everything on the east shut down because nobody wanted the money anymore because they knew that in 3 days' time it was worthless.
Yeah, no. I mean, we've seen plenty of currencies either get hyper devalued or disappear entirely when the government or environment changed. I think that when it comes to games specifically, I think there's upsides and downsides. I certainly think that there is, games have used in-game economies and reward structures for, a very long time. And in fact, how we build those systems makes a massive impact, even outside of the fun of the game, the way that we choose to dole out rewards, even rewards that are kind of non-fungible or rewards that are just, gold stars, as Richard put it, makes a big difference to people's feelings and emotional impacts and how they choose to behave, right? So for example, even just leaving aside, so in our game Soulforge Fusion, we reward experience points for you and your deck of cards whenever you complete a game, regardless of whether you win or lose. But if you we found that a lot of people were forfeiting in their online games because when they felt they were losing, because they got more points when they won and they just didn't want to play anymore. And so we stopped rewarding any experience points when you forfeit. And that changed the behaviors dramatically, right? So now people okay, they'll finish the game so people can have the experience of completing a good game because we changed the reward systems. So how we design those reward systems matters a ton. And there's a question of if it's, gold stars or experience points is the rewards, or if it's, let's just, for sake of example, it's a currency that can be exchanged for real dollars, or you're rewarding real dollars. As again, I played in competitive Magic tournaments for real dollars, all the time growing up. That was how I kind of got into this industry. It changes the equation, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. When you have something at stake, it changes the emotional impact of the game. I don't know how you think about those kinds of trade-offs.
Well, I'm a poker player.
There you go.
I know exactly what you mean. And yeah, it completely changes the dynamic of the game. I can't play poker for play money. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Yes, exactly. Poker is a really boring game without something on the line, and it's an unbelievably deep and fascinating game with something on the line, with a lot, especially with a lot on the line.
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah, well, with poker, it's got to hurt. If it doesn't hurt, if you were playing Elon Musk at poker and you were playing with the same kind of money you normally pay for poker, well, that's like fractions of a penny to him. So yeah, it wouldn't hurt him, except for maybe his self-esteem. But in a game world, yes, we do have rewards, and a lot of the rewards are in context rewards. So if you're playing an MMO, typically there'll be an in-game currency like gold pieces or something, and in theory, you can sell those. You're not supposed to be able to, but you can usually find a buyer for them. If you say, look, I'll give you 10,000 of these if you give me £1 or $1 or whatever, then yeah, sure, you can find buyers. So they can be converted into fiat currency, but they've only got value because in the MMO, that's what the NPCs take. Now, if you add the second currency, one that might be blockchain based, and the NPCs accept that, or at least the cash shop accepts that, well, that does give you some other value for it, but it's only valuable because it's in the game. It's like shares in a company are only valuable really because of the dividends they pay, or the expected dividends that they're going to pay, or the amount of money the company actually owns, the assets the company owns. So if you're buying something, if you've got some currency that's convertible within the game, okay, well, I can see how that's valuable to players of that game. But it's only valuable while the game's there. Once the game's finished, what blockchain gives you is, well, here's a currency that doesn't have any value in the game, but it's like a Roman pot. You can't use it. You can't use it for drinking out of, but it's rare and they don't make them anymore. So, you got a museum of.
I think we all agree that there's a core entity that matters for purposes of how you would value these things, whether that be the U.S. government and the U.S. dollar, or SoulForge's digital currency and the SoulForge game, or a company's likely future profits, right? So that you mentioned stocks, which is a great example, right? Obviously, people don't just value stocks based on the dividends that they pay now, but it's also your projections of what's going to happen in the future. And so people choose to value a thing based on sometimes they value it based on their emotional experiences of it, or what happened in the news that day, or whatever. There's a world of player, human expectations in terms of how they value things, and some of that is the actual utility, some of that is the projected utility, some of that is the value of your identity and the personal network that you are part of it. I value, I have a belief and set of stories around the United States, or the set of stories around Bitcoin, or a set of stories around the in-game gold in World of Warcraft that maybe decide how I'm going to value it and what's going to happen there. Nigel, what do you think about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's another problem you've got that you might haven't have considered this in the wider world. So let's assume that you are really successful in creating this system of rewards and obligations within game, and that it expands beyond the confines of the game. I mean, we've seen the Linden dollar is kind of tradable, right? You expand it, become too successful, and then what happens is the government wants its share. And And we have had, there's a law going through Parliament like this week. It was announced about a week or so ago, which is designed to give certainty to Bitcoin holdings. I forget the name. I think it's called the Digital Assets Bill or something. It's the new government, and it's probably a one-line thing that says Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is property. Because you have a problem, right? So supposing somebody steals your Bitcoin, right? Is that theft? Well, at the moment, it might not be, because it has to be property, and if it's not property, then it can't be stolen, and therefore you're acquitted.
Well, and this is the thing, and again, we're getting into the weeds and some theory and philosophy here, which I love. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this conversation as much as I am and our audience is. But these things all need to be wrestled with, right? So when we talk about the value of the idea of intellectual property at all, right? That's required a lot of regulation and a lot of forethought about what does intellectual property mean? What does it mean you have the right to do? What don't you have the right to do? When do your rights expire? Why would we have those rights? Right? There's a version of property rights that were worked out over thousands of years, hundreds of years. We have the version of intellectual property rights and information rights that we have on the internet, and especially since the internet has formed, of how am I allowed to communicate with you? What of the things I create belong to me? What are the protocols that we allow to communicate with each other? How can I be regulated or not regulated? And I think the idea that excited me about the entire kind of cryptocurrency space is that there's this idea of digital property, which I've seen many games did used to have an idea of digital property. So Second Life is one. The original version of Magic Online, you had, your cards you own. But now almost all of them have moved in the direction of you don't actually own anything, right? It's all, we're licensing you the rights to use these things. You don't actually own everything. We have full control. And so it's moved into a more centralized control, less property rights model. And the same is true for your data when you use services like Google or Facebook or any of those things. And I like the idea that it's forcing our society to wrestle with no, actually, you should have rights to your digital life and your digital property, and that there's something of value there. There's a lot of pitfalls, don't get me wrong, and I'm happy. That's why I'm interested to explore them. But I think this idea of, as we move our lives more entirely online, as our real relationships and our real connections and our real work all lives online, is there a solution here that gives us more rights and more control as an individual than what it seems like society is pushing towards?
Well, the challenge is certainly there. I mean, you look around. Richard's got a ton of books. I've got books, right? I can give Richard a book. He can give me a book. Yes. Kindle? Maybe not. You're licensing it on your device, whether it's all your devices or one device. And can you pass it on? Maybe. Problems, libraries. Lending libraries are struggling with this right now. There are some lawsuits going around right now. Yeah, all I can say is the challenges are here.
The thing is that games have got a special case in that if the players actually owned the things that their character owns, or even if they owned their character, that would be a disaster for most MMOs. I mean, it would be really, really bad. It would mean that if anything that you did was destroyed, your sword wore out. Hey, you've broken my sword. That's worth money. Where's my compensation? You broke it. And you can't do anything. It would be impossible to nerf characters. You have made my warlock worthless by increasing or decreasing the value of some spell. You can't. So virtual worlds have got to be protected.
Sure, though I think that's a little bit of a specious argument. I mean, again, I'll use the case because my background is in Magic the Gathering, and tradable, collectible cards are worth millions of dollars in some cases, mostly, and lots of money. And the main, the company that produces them can ban cards from tournaments. They can reprint cards. They can pull cards out of print, and those all have massive impacts on the value of your things. And there's no legal lawsuits. There's no press. There's no problems with that. So you can still say, yes, you own your character, but we have the rights to change the rules within the game because that's the part that we control. But you own your character and your thing, and you can take it with you whenever you want. I don't think that's realistically.
So what does owning your character mean? What is your character?
Yeah, sorry. No, I want to clarify it, right? Again, their ownership, as I mentioned, with intellectual property and digital and ownership, there's a variety of different sub rights that come with that, and we have to decide which ones matter. At a baseline, the ability to say I can sell it, I can trade it, I can buy it, I can destroy it, and as if I want to, those are ownership rights that are you can't take it from me without my permission. Those would be a baseline set of ownership rights.
What is the it that you're talking about?
Sure. In this case, it would be a specific configuration of traits or a digital representation of, I'll use the example of SoulForge Fusion. Every deck is one of a kind, unique, right? Yeah. So you have the rights to this particular deck. No one else has the rights to use that deck. It has its own specific cards in it. It has its own history and traits. And that's now, and again, I can't destroy it because it's those ones that are turned into, that are on a digital ledger. I can't get rid of it. Now I have the ability to say in my game, when you connect it to the game, I can change how it engages with the game, or what experience you're allowed to earn, or which tournaments you're allowed to participate in, or those kinds of things I can do. But you still have that specific configuration that no one else will ever have. And
what you've got there is a configuration of pointers, and the pointers point to things, and the things they point to can change. You say you own this you own this particular card. Well, what do you mean? What's the thing that you're owning? You're owning a pointer to something, and that thing can be changed. I could change it so that what you say it's a Black Lotus in Magic the Gathering, and you turn it to land.
Yeah, and so that doesn't. It doesn't quite work that way, because it's, again, these things are the way we've done it. And again, we're getting a little in the weeds for my project, but like we put all of those things not pointing to like our website, but pointing to a decentralized file storage system. So we can't change the fact that it's a Black Lotus. But what I could say is you're not allowed to play like as Magic does, right? You can't play the Black Lotus in most tournaments because it's too expensive and too rare. And so they don't let you play with it. So I could say you have your Black Lotus deck, but I won't let you play it in these tournaments because I want to protect the new players that didn't get access to the Black Lotus.
Well,
but you can play in these other tournaments.
What you're actually saying is you can change the rules whenever you like if you're the god.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, of course. And I am very much of the opinion, which I think I would guess that you both share, that as a game designer and core creator, you still need to have control over your game system in order to make sure that it is fun and the experience you want.
I'm just wondering what makes what you own a Black Lotus. What makes it that? Why is it a Black Lotus?
What makes a Black Lotus a Black Lotus? What makes it? It's again. It has a certain. It has a certain. It has certain art. It has certain text on the card. It has a certain traits. Whatever those traits are, it has. And then the fact that I own it is, and so that's all true, and I can't, and immutable in the blockchain as well.
So all the traits, these are the values and everything. They're all on the blockchain, and these are what the points worth. And that's the whole thing is on the blockchain. Now, for a player character, okay, in an MMO. Yeah, okay, we're maybe talking several megabytes there. But what those things mean, it's all woven into the hierarchy. It's as if, yes, this player's got this value in a class system that goes all the way up of C++ class system. It's not that you've simply got data, binary data. That's not what your character is, because that is meaningless without the code to execute.
Yes, data. It has to have the context. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Without the context, it doesn't have. I mean, again, it can be an artifact. It can be an art piece. It can be if Magic stopped existing and nobody played it ever, you might still care about a Black Lotus as as you would an ancient coin or whatever piece of art. But it's of course dependent in the context of the game. And I do think there's this interesting tension, which is I think what we're all kind of dancing around between what is the thing that is immutable, what is the thing that you own, what's the value of that, versus what is the thing that is mutable, that is controlled by the designer or the centralized system, and how that works. And similarly
you said how you like philosophy. I think we're talking about Sinn and Bedeutung here.
So say that. Sorry, I'm not familiar with that term.
Well, the German expressions, but it's Sinn and Bedeutung. It's the thing and the meaning of it.
Okay.
How do you label something, and what does it really mean in intrinsically?
Yeah, that sounds right. And I think that to zoom back out maybe of that, specifically with blockchain, but this idea of creating meaning is a big part of what the game space tries to do, right? We create an artificial world and we build artificial constraints for artificial goals that somehow magically people choose to really, really care about, right? I joke about this a lot. Like, why do I care about like getting more points, getting a ball into a hoop or capturing a king or, slaying a virtual dragon? Why do I care about those things at all? It's just there's this magic circle that there's something about the way we craft the experience that makes people suddenly care and makes people bring value to this equation, again, regardless of whether it's permanent or ownable or whatever, or a tabletop game. How do you think about how we create, kind of how you create that sense of value and meaning, since that's really a lot of our jobs, right? We're trying to build that for players in a way that is in many ways defines their life and their friendships and real goals that can often be more meaningful than the job that they go to during the day. And how do you think about building value in that sense?
My field is, which is MMOs, as I keep coming back to them. People play them for different reasons, and people have got different things that they think are valuable. So some people, in your terms, are trying to learn because, as you said, games are often about learning, and explorer types, they really want to learn things. But achiever types aren't so much wanting to learn because they've learned quite a lot already. What they really want to do is to get a sense that what they've learned has meaning. Socializers, why are they playing? It's nothing to do with learning except learning about themselves and other people. But then if that's your definition of learning, well, pretty well everything that humans do is learning. So people will play games for different reasons, and the idea would be that you try to develop your game. If it's a single player or a small group game, you develop it for particular interests that the players would have, that they would want to experience. So if you make a game that's intensely competitive, that's going to attract a certain type of people. But if you create a word game, that's going to attract, for single player, that's going to attract a different set of people for different reasons. It's an intellectual puzzle game. Overall, as you say, what makes things have meaning? Well, whatever people do has a meaning. They're doing, if they've got the freedom to do it and they chose to do it, then they're doing it for a reason. In MMOs, that reason is ultimately to find out who they are. But in other games, it could be for completely different purposes. And that's what is it you want to say to them? Because through the game, you're speaking to them and stroking the reason that they're playing, or defining it even.
If I can just sort of add to that, I think what we're talking about is the creativity of the game designer. So if you're Taylor Swift or you're Adele or give a long list of any, that they all come to their music with a different spin. So or Amy Winehouse. So more recent ones, right? So it's the same with the game designer. I think you can only go and tell the story, and it's all story, capital S, probably all capitals. It's all story. And you can only tell the story that you want to tell. I'll give you a particular example. About a year ago, I had to review a number of games of all different kinds, and I went through them. And there were some that were supposed to be real popular. They were very shiny. The graphics were utterly superb. And I gave up after about half an hour. Now, I've been really busy the last 40 years. I've not spent as much time as playing games as I did when I was at university, which is one reason I didn't do too well at university first time round. And Richard knows the quote. But there was another I came across, which was the remake of King's Quest. And I went through all of that from beginning to end. It was the experience I had doing that 12 months ago was equivalent to when Roy and I sat down to play the original adventure, Colossal Cave. I was tempted to go and look at the remake of Colossal Cave, and I thought, well, no, my own imagination is probably better, left where it was. But so it's the story the original designer wants to tell. Richard, what do you think?
Well, some of the original designers do want to tell a story, but there are better ways to tell a story than using a game. What games are they're machines for generating stories. When you play a game, things happen. There's a record of events. Some of those events are important to you. They're the ones that stick in your memory. They're the ones that inform what you're going to do next. When you look at the causality of them, you get a plot. If I do this and do this, then this should happen. Will it happen? Do I want to risk that happening? Should I try something else? And ultimately, when you play a game and you look back on what you've done, there's a story, because the game, through playing the game, has generated that story. If there isn't a story, then nothing interesting happened. And if nothing interesting happened, why were you playing the game? Even completely abstract games with no fiction at all, like Tetris, have got a story. If you play a game of Tetris and you're telling someone else about that game of Tetris, then you'll be saying, well, I mean, the usual thing, it's building up, you're keeping a slot down the left for the 4-1, and it's not coming, and it's coming, and oh my God, and suddenly this 4-1 comes, down it goes, bam, another one, bam, bam, oh my God. Look, and
Richard, you're right.
Tetris.
And the reason you're right, I say that, is many, many years ago, I used to get the boat across from here, where Richard and I are at the moment, from a town called Harwich to the Hook of Holland. And there was this was in the late 70s, early 80s, and they had a Pengo machine. Anybody remember Pengo? That was... I fed so much Dutch currency into that machine, because it was all about these penguins moving these ice blocks around and avoiding the snow bees. You're right. You can tell a story, and that story had me feeding these quarters into that machine.
Yeah.
Right. With games where you get to tell a story that you, the player, are the hero of the story, right? You get to actually be the agent in creation.
The game designer can direct the story, because people aren't necessarily good at creating their own stories. So if you give them exciting or interesting events, I mean, the interesting decisions, that's what gameplay is, charting your way through the different tensions that form the game. So you can do that. A game is the game system will always give you a story, but you can layer on top of that your own fiction, your own story, to give meaning to things. And some games are completely ruined when you change the fiction. I remember visiting some friends who were making a game years ago, and it was a sheepdog game, and you were controlling sheep with your sheepdog, and the publisher said, "That's good, but who's interested in sheepdog? Make it polar bears doing penguins, herding penguins." But polar bears and penguins live on opposite sides of the it doesn't matter.
This was a Hollywood producer, right?
It was I think it was a Japanese company, but the person was British, and so they made this game, and of course it was a complete flop. Whereas the charming original one, which was exactly the same game just with different pictures, would probably not have been a flop. It would
have been a hit in my home county of Lancashire, and I suspect Yorkshire as well.
Yeah, probably would have been. But penguins being herded by polar bears wasn't quite as cute as farmer with a corncob pipe herd and a sheepdog herding. Yeah. Well, anyway. So
yeah, well, each aspect of the game matters to craft the experience, right? The story, the visuals, not just the mechanics and the mathematics of it, and the context within which it is presented to you. All of those things matter, right? If I'm playing in a tournament and there's money on the line, or I'm playing casually at home, or it's being introduced around the family dinner table, like every one of those things impacts how players will experience your game. And so that's important to understand the broader context and the things you have control over and the things you don't.
Without gameplay, you've got no game. That's the key. Everything else can change, but if it's got no graphics, you can have a game with sound, you can have a game with text, but if it's got no gameplay, then it's not a game. It's something else. So that's the core of it. That's the only thing that games have that nothing else has, gameplay. And that's where the art must be carried. The art of game design is the art of expressing things procedurally through gameplay. You can express things through the look, you can express things through the social interactions, you can express them in many other ways, but if it doesn't have gameplay, then you can express that probably better in a different medium. If it's got gameplay, that's the only thing you've got, and that's why games designers need to speak through the gameplay rather than a lot of these self-conscious art games where the triangles mean this and the circles mean that, and the birds represent your soaring ambition. Right, yeah. Gameplay. What does that mean?
All right. So I know there's so many things I could keep this conversation going forever, but I want to be respectful of time. So we're getting into some core things of as advice to current new game designers, people who are breaking into the industry. Obviously focusing on the gameplay, the core of play itself is one of them. Maybe some parting words of wisdom to those that are trying to follow in your footsteps or craft new experiences and to the next generation. And I'll start with Nigel, since Richard, you just got to give us a good one. And if you come up with another one before we close, I'll come back to you.
Well, look, Richard knows my thinking on this. Although it's had some criticism in recent years, I would say if you've not studied the hero's journey and the monomyth, go read it up. Everybody's watched Star Wars, right? So classic example. But there's so many, Lord of the Rings. There's so many examples out there. Don't take it too seriously, but you can't go far wrong if you tell a story in those terms. So that's my quick cheat.
Yep. And I recommend Joseph Campbell specifically. The Power of Myth was the book form of that interview was the one that resonated with me the most. But anything of his is great to get you an introduction to that story. And I'll give a little aside before I come back to Richard to close it off. Which for me, I started studying the hero's journey as part of my game designer journey, my game designer skill set. I wanted to be able to tell better stories and allow people to tell better stories in my games. And after reading those books, I actually realized that it was so impactful to my day-to-day life that we want to create these narratives and go through these arcs in our life, and that being able to view your life through that story and be able to tell a powerful story about your life was real game changing for me. So I would echo your advice and say not just for being better, being a game designer, but being better.
And just as a PS to that, to be in a position where you can look back over 50, 60 years and say, yeah, I did that. That's a good place to be.
Yes. Well, I look forward to that. Not quite there yet, but but it also, it puts things into context. Sorry, just to give another thing, because I'm passionate about this topic, is like that the struggles and the challenges that you face gain meaning through that retroactive storytelling, that you can say that the things that I went through that let me accomplish and become who I am, allow you to be grateful for even the struggles and, quote unquote failures that happen. In fact, is key to a good hero's journey. There's no good hero's journey that's like, I started off great, everything went great, ended great, cool. All right, Richard, you want to close us off with any final words of wisdom here?
Well, I could rant about not so much rant about the hero's journey, which does apply when people play virtual worlds. That's what they're doing. They're going to another world of magic and mystery and intrigue and following it through. And I'd also say, if you are going to study the hero's journey, study Campbell's 17-step version. Don't go for the 12 steps or the 8 steps or the even 5-step versions. And if you read Campbell, it's borderline impenetrable. So don't expect an easy read. Anyway, as a final advice for game designers, I would say make sure that game design is your medium. Make sure that you've got something that you want to express through a game. If you know what you're trying to say, all the decisions that you need to make will just fall out. I want this to be about, my case, freedom. Is that what this is giving me? No, off it goes. Or no, how can I make it give me? But if you don't have any artistic spine if you don't have something that says this is all about the corruptness that people in power always gain, or if you don't say this is about the way that poor people hang together, or whatever other chips you have on your shoulder, if you don't have anything to say, you're not going to say anything. And if you want to be a game designer, game design has to be what you want to say. That has to be your medium.
So just that's great. I want one addendum question that comes from that. If somebody's listening to this and they're like, wow, wait, I don't know what I have to say. What do I have to say? I want to be a game designer, but I don't know what I have to say. Is there a way to then they can discover that? Like, how do you go about that process of knowing what you want to say?
Well, why do you want to be a game designer? Ever since I was a small child, I've always wanted to play in games. Yes, but ever since you were a small child, you've lived in houses. You don't want to be an architect or a construction worker. Ever since you were a small child, you used to eat food, but you don't want to be a baker or a chef. What is it about games that you want to be? I want to have other people have a blast. Okay, why do you want other people to have a blast? Because it's going to make you feel good or them feel good. Why? Yeah. Just keep asking yourself, what is it? And if you make games, why am I making this game? I mean, you've got to just make games. If you don't,
right.
And most of the ones you make, you're not going to finish. They're not even going to be coded. They're going to be written pieces of paper or in Word files or whatever. But if you don't design games, you don't know, you're not going to find your reason for designing games.
Another way to put it is, what do you want to change about the world? What irritates you? What gets you angry even? What if?
Oh, love it. Perfect place to end it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. This was an amazing podcast. Richard, it's great to have you back. Nigel, it's great to have you here for the first time. This has been really fantastic. So thank you both.
Anytime.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. If you want to support the podcast, please rate, comment, and share on your favorite podcast platforms, such as iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever device you're listening on. Listener reviews and shares make a huge difference and help us grow this community, and will allow me to bring more amazing guests and insights to you. I've taken the insights from these interviews, along with my 20 years of experience in the game industry, and compressed it all into a book with the same title as this podcast, Think Like a Game Designer. In it, I give step-by-step instructions on how to apply the lessons from these great designers and bring your own games to life. If you think you might be interested, you can check out the book at thinklikeagamedesigner.com or wherever fine books are sold.